Hi everybody, this is the first of two videos on planning instruction. So in previous videos, we've discussed proactive strategies with regards to arranging the environment to set up your students for success. These videos are similar in that we are still going to discuss proactive strategies, but these strategies revolve around your learners' academic needs and how to address and plan for those needs in the lesson planning stage. This is really important for setting your students up for success. If you don't address student needs in the planning stage, then you might teach a lesson in a way that the learner just doesn't understand, and or it might be too challenging for that learner. And if this happens, then your learner is going to get frustrated and probably engage in challenging behavior and not learn the academic tasks that you want them to learn. Now you have to use reactive strategies to actually teach the concept and also deal with the challenging behavior, and it just results in a really stressful classroom environment. So figuring out your learner's needs and addressing them in the planning stage allows you to teach on the learner's level, which results in the learner being more likely to understand the lesson and be engaged in the lesson, which in turn decreases challenging behavior and makes the whole classroom environment more enjoyable and less stressful, which is great. So for this video, our objectives are on the left, and for our agenda, we're going to talk about the phases of learning, preparing lessons. We're going to look at what a task analysis is and kind of how to create one. We're going to talk about writing instructional or behavioral objectives, and then also measuring those instructional or behavioral objectives. So let's briefly talk about the phases of learning. With regards to the phases of learning, this is just kind of like an overall concept that I want you guys to keep in mind when you're doing your lesson planning, and just to keep in mind when you watch this video and also the second video. So we have 5 phases of learning, and we look at them along a learning curve. So you guys can see this learning curve right here. The first stage is the acquisition stage. So this part right here. This is a really slow stage. It's a laborious stage, and it's a really challenging stage. So this is a stage where the kids are actually learning and acquiring the skill. So at the very beginning, you're not going to get a lot of correct responses, and then as they start to acquire the skill, you're going to see their performance increase and increase. And so because this phase is just really challenging, the student might get frustrated and you might get some challenging behavior. You might hear something like, "This is stupid," or "This is too hard." But the more you can prompt them and get them to engage in the correct response, and the more they start to acquire the skill, then the more successful they'll be, and the less you'll start to hear these things. Once the kid has acquired the skill and is consistently responding correctly, then they move into the fluency stage. The fluency stage focuses on them responding quickly and accurately. And so you can see the steep slope in the fluency stage up here. The fluency stage is something like, after they've acquired their math facts, you're going to work on them saying as many as they can within 1 minute. And it's also better if you work on fluency within small doses of dispersed practice, as opposed to one big mass practice session. And we share that with regards to studying as well, just in general. I'm sure you guys have had professors that have told you guys to study a little bit each night, or study a little bit of your classes every other day, something like that, as opposed to studying for 6 hours and staying up and cramming the night before an exam. You learn better, you maintain the information better, you're more fluent with the material if you have these dispersed study sessions as opposed to one big massed study session. Okay, after the student can respond quickly and accurately, then they move into the maintenance phase. So now you're going to see if they can maintain the skill over time. So when you're not actively practicing the skill and you kind of stop targeting it, can you ask them a week later and will they respond correctly? Can you ask them a month later and will they respond correctly? And so basically you go into not practicing every time. Practicing is intermittent. The feedback decreases and you're just seeing, hey, does this skill keep up over time? If it does, then you'll go into the generalization stage. So this is when you want to see if the child or the learner can engage in the skill in an environment that it wasn't actually taught in. So for instance, if you're teaching, addition in the classroom, the kid go in the real world and actually add items together and things like that. So it's kind of that real world application of a skill. Can the kid engage in the skill in a different setting, in the cafeteria, at home, on the playground, with different teachers? Those are all instances of generalization. Once the skill has generalized, then the learner moves into the adaptation phase. And this is when they kind of invent new methods of using a skill. They kind of get their creative juices flowing and they creatively use the skill, essentially. One example that I always think about whenever I think about these phases of learning is a long time ago, I'm going to date myself, there was when American Idol, within the first couple of seasons of American Idol, there was a guy that I think he won, but one of the songs he sang was an acoustic slow version of Billie Jean, which I thought was really, really cool. And so I always think about how he came to actually learn the song that way. And so I think of him kind of sitting down with his guitar and actually learning Billie Jean at the fast pace way that Michael Jackson sang it. And once he learned the song, then he would move into the fluency phase where he would practice the song and practice and practice and practice it, where he could actually kind of do it in his sleep. And then he would start to perform the song. He wouldn't practice it so much, but he would perform it, maybe every week or in a month until he could actually maintain the song like that. And then he would probably start singing it in different settings, for different people, in different environments, maybe at restaurants, and start playing it in front of people. And then after that, once he got that all situated, then he started playing around with kind of how to look at that song creatively. And he came up with this really slow acoustic version of Billie Jean. And so that's kind of what I think about when I think about kind of going through those phases of learning. All right, so we can't just teach the same skill in the same way to everyone. And so I asked you guys, why can't we do that? So I want you guys to just think of that for a little bit. And the answer is basically that not all of our learners are in the same stage. So if you have a kid or if you want to teach in the fluency stage, so you want to work on fluency, getting them to do their math acts as quickly and accurately as possible, or sight words, or whatever it is that you're teaching, and the kids haven't actually acquired those skills, then they're not going to be successful in the fluency phase, and therefore they're going to get frustrated and you're going to get challenging behavior. So keep that in mind. And there are some really simple things that you guys can do, some questions you can ask yourself, some observations you can make to figure out what phase of learning your students are in. And so, the first one, have you observed the kid doing the behavior, or can the kid perform the skill when prompted? If no, then they're still in the acquisition phase. If yes, then you want to ask yourself, does the behavior occur quickly, easily, and without any type of delay when you're prompted, or when the learner is prompted? If no, they're in fluency. If yes, then they've mastered fluency. You would go to the next question. Does the behavior maintain fluency even after extended periods of time without any instruction? If your answer is no, then they might have learned the skill and been fluent with it at one time, but it didn't maintain. If you answer yes, then they pass the maintenance phase. So then you want to ask, does the behavior occur in novel settings with other people at other times and under different circumstances? If no, they're in generalization. If yes, they pass generalization. And then lastly, can the student adapt the skill in untrained ways when necessary? And that would be your adaptation phase. So those are just some quick questions that you guys can ask yourself to assess the phase of learning for a particular learner or a particular student. And this is especially important for our kids with EBD because remember, their academic skills are lower, their social skills are lower. So you might think that by now they should be in the fluency stage, but they might not actually be. And a lot of times teachers teach above the level of these kids, and like I said, that's when the kids get frustrated, they throw desks, they engage in those challenging behaviors, and they don't actually learn the academic task. They either get out of it by going to the office, and basically, teaching at a higher phase than your learner is actually at does not set them up for success. It gets them really frustrated, and the system kind of crumbles. So let's talk about preparing your lessons. I want to ask you guys, why do teachers need to prepare lessons in light of student needs? Why is it important to take your students' needs into account at the very beginning during the lesson planning stage, as opposed to just presenting the lesson, seeing what your students need, and adapting it that way? And the main reason is kind of what we talked about in the previous slides, but I like this quote from your book. It says, trying to teach acquisition of a skill without having first taught the prerequisite steps is a very predictable prescription for failure, boredom, and misbehavior. So basically, if you just go in there and teach and don't take into account your students' needs, and they don't have, especially in the acquisition phase, they don't have those prerequisite skills, then they're not going to be successful. They're going to get frustrated. You're going to get challenging behavior, and your lesson's going to fall apart. So taking into account the students' needs in that lesson planning period, like I said, proactive strategy, it allows you to teach on the learner's level. It allows you to address any prerequisite skills that they need so that you can teach those, and therefore they can be successful with the actual skill that you want them to learn. And I like to kind of think of this puzzle piece, or putting a puzzle together. You have to have the whole puzzle, all the pieces for the puzzle to be complete. If you're missing a piece, then you're not going to be able to finish and complete the puzzle. So to teach a skill, to completely teach a skill, you need to have all the puzzle pieces or all of your prerequisite skills taught before you actually teach the learner the skill that you want to. So let's talk about some academic tasks, and what are some sub-skills that you guys can think of. So if you think of triple digit addition, what are some sub-skills or prerequisite skills that the child might need? And here are just a couple. You guys might think of more, but knowledge of place value, single digit addition without grouping, single digit addition with grouping, and so on. So whatever else you guys came up with. So the kid needs to have these prerequisite skills before you actually teach that triple digit addition. Let's think about summarizing a reading passage. What type of prerequisite skills or sub-skills does a child need before you want to teach summarizing a reading passage? And here are just a couple. Letter identification, letter sound correspondence, decoding single syllable words, sight word recognition, fluency reading, comprehension of words read, ability to recall information, the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, the ability to discriminate important facts from details, and things like that. And so those are two academic examples, the 3-digit math problems and then the summarizing your reading passage. But we can also apply this concept to behavioral issues as well, or teaching behavioral skills. So say you have the skill, teacher tells the kids to line up, and you have the skill of actually lining up. So what we want to do, you have little Johnny, for instance, and little Johnny is having trouble lining up. You get some challenging behavior when the teacher instructs little Johnny to line up. So let's kind of break this skill down. When we think about lining up, let's think about the kind of steps in order that the child needs to follow. First, they need to make eye contact with the teacher and wait quietly. Then they need to wait for a teacher's signal. Then they need to move to the line. And then they need to stay straight and quiet. And if they follow all of these 4 steps, then they will have a successful lineup. So, okay, let's observe Johnny and see which ones he can do and which ones he can't do. So he does make eye contact. He does wait for the teacher's signal, but he doesn't move to the line, and he's not standing straight and quiet. So this is where our kind of system breaks down with Johnny. He can wait for the teacher's signal, but he can't do this third step of moving to the line. So let's take moving to the line and let's break it down into its subcomponents or kind of those prerequisite skills. And so we can actually break this down into 4 steps. Stand up when prompted, push in your chair, walk directly to the line, and stand at the end. So within this breakdown, let's kind of see where Johnny is. So he does stand up when prompted, he does push his chair in, but he doesn't walk directly to the line and he doesn't stand at the end. So we see right here is where little Johnny breaks down. So this is where our instruction should begin. So our teaching should focus on breaking down that step 3, and we don't need to teach step 1, step 2, step 3.1, or step 3.2. He can do that. If you teach that, you're going to waste resources, you're going to waste your time, you're going to waste the student's time. And it's going to be too easy for him because he already knows it. But you can start teaching right here. It's on his level. You can prompt him. And once you've successfully taught, walking directly to the line, then you'll teach stand at the end, and then you'll go on to staying straight and quiet. So when we break things down like this, and we kind of get a complex skill and we break it down into small steps that we can teach, and this kid's more likely to be successful when we teach it with smaller steps as opposed to just, the whole complex skill. This is what we call, when we break it down like this is what we call a task analysis. And a task analysis is necessary when you have that complex skill that needs to be deconstructed and broken down into those smaller teachable steps. And we actually have task analyses all the time in the real world. If you guys have ever used your navigation systems for directions, I know I use Waze all the time. I'm so bad with directions, but it'll tell you to, turn right, go through streets, turn left. That's a task analysis. It's broken down a complex task and tells you exactly each step to do. If you guys have ever cooked using a recipe, that's a task analysis. If you guys have ever put together a desk or a piece of furniture and you've read them, followed the instructions go step by step. So that's another example of a task analysis. And to be an effective teacher, effective teachers use task analyses as the basis for planning their instruction. So they plan their instruction around where that kid needs, what part of the task analysis that kid needs to learn. And that way the teacher has, from the planning stage, has brought themselves to the learner's level. They know what skills the learner needs to learn. They know what the learner can do. They know what the learner can't do. And therefore, them teaching at that level is more likely for the learner to be successful and to actually acquire that complex skill in these small steps. Okay, there are a couple different task analysis methods. So during planning, once again, these are proactive strategies that you're going to do during your lesson planning. You want to kind of think through all the tasks that will be required and how you're going to accomplish each task. And so there can be different aspects of a task analysis. You can look at task difficulty, so actually teaching the task. If you're trying to teach a kid how to raise his hand and he's not raising his hand, then you might want to break that down into the different components and make a task analysis. So keep your elbow straight, hold your hand still, put your hand in the air, and hold your hand in place. And then you want to look at kind of the temporal sequence. So, you might need to teach the learner when they need to raise their hand. So when you think, when you want to say something, raise your hand, look at the teacher, and wait quietly for the teacher. And then you might have to increase the number of times the kid is engaging in the skill, which you're kind of building fluency here. So he might raise his hands on maybe 45% of opportunities, So now you're going to get Tim to raise his hand on 50%. Once he's doing that, 60%. Once he's doing that, 70%. And work your way up to your end goal, which for this example, we want to be 90% of opportunities in which he's raising his hand. And I want to say that with this criterion section, you want to base it off of the baseline. So, and you want to make your criterion attainable. So make it realistic. So you're going to basically take data on how many times it's naturally occurring in the environment, or if you're doing duration, how long it's occurring in the natural environment. With regards to hand raising, how many times it's occurring per day, or how many times a kid hand raises per opportunity. And like I said earlier, if you figure out from baseline, he raises his hand about 40-45% of opportunities, then you want to raise that baseline level just a little bit. So you want it to be a little bit challenging, but you want it to be realistic and attainable because you want to set your student up for success. So you don't want to, if he's only raising his hand 45% of opportunities, you don't want to go ahead and just automatically go to 90. You want to go a little bit above your baseline, make sure it's attainable, that way you set them up for success, and then start increasing your criterion from there until you get to the criterion that your end goal, what you finally want. Okay, writing instructional or behavioral objectives. So once you guys realize that your learner is not engaging in a complex skill, you need to break it down, you do your task analysis. After you get your task analysis, you want to create objectives, and these are full descriptions of the steps in the task analysis. So you want to, typically with your objectives, and I have instructional / behavioral, so they follow the same components. It's just one has to deal with instructional academic tasks and one deals with behavioral skills. But whether you're talking about instructional or behavioral objectives, they contain the same components. So you always want to state the learner, so the learner's name, who you're referring to, the behavior, so what you're wanting to teach, the conditions, under what conditions does behavior occur, and then the criterion or the criteria. So how much is enough to consider the skill mastered? And so with these 4 components, there are different ways that you can format your objectives. And I have this one written right here because this is the way that I like to write them, if at all possible, and the way that I format them. But just realize that they could be in a different format, but they should have those 4 conditions in them. All right, so why is it important to have behavioral objectives? And I think the answer to this comes within the name objectives, in that it makes what you're observing and what you're measuring objective. It makes everything very clear and very detailed. With a behavioral objective, there's no guessing in there. You're not guessing on what the behavior looks like, or if the behavior occurred, or when it's supposed to occur, or anything like that. You've actually planned out. You know what behavior you're measuring, you know when it's supposed to occur, and you have picked out how you're going to measure it, your data collection system, and you're actually measuring the behavior, and you have a set criteria as to what you consider with regards to your measurement system, how many times the kid needs to engage in the behavior, or whatever it is, for us to determine that that objective is mastered. And if somebody else comes in, they can look at your behavioral objective and they can also be on the same page, because everything is observable and measurable and stated in positive terms, and everything else that we talked about, clear, concise, and complete. So I think it just takes out any guesswork. It explicitly states, what you're measuring, when it's supposed to occur, and the criteria, so you know if it's mastered or when it's mastered for you to move on to the next one. So let's kind of look at these 4 components in just a little more detail. First one, identify the learner. So you're going to say something like John will, or the 4th graders will. Second one, identifying the target behavior. So think back to our considering behavior video when we talked about how to operationally define a behavior. Same concepts can be are implied. So you're going to use, like I just stated, those observable terms, measurable terms, positive terms, and be clear, concise, and complete. And remember, with our observable terms, you want to make sure that you use action verbs. Action verbs are directly observable. They describe what the person is actually doing. And you want to stay away from labels. Labels are ambiguous and can be interpreted different ways by different people. So stick to what the person is actually doing, use those objective terms, and use your action verbs. That can ensure that you're actually describing behaviors. So here's just examples. Recognize the difference, or point to, will verbally count, will look. Those are examples of using action verbs. You want to identify the conditions of the intervention. And I just gave you guys examples here, but there can be there can be lots of conditions. So you can have a verbal request and also materials that need to be used, as well as a setting, things like that. So you might describe the materials when completing a worksheet with 20 different single addition problems. You might have an environmental setting or something in there. You might say during independent work time when completing a worksheet with 20 single-digit addition problems. All of those are the conditions under which the behavior needs to occur. And then the criteria, that's how we measure whether we decide, hey, has the person engaged in the skill enough for us to say that it's mastered, so we can move on to the next objective. So, if you're doing opportunity recording, so you've decided from your behavior, you're going to measure frequency, and for the behavior to occur, there has to be an opportunity, so you're going to do opportunity recording. Okay, so what's your criteria? How many correct responses does the child have to make for you to say that they've mastered that skill? So it might be 7 out of 20. If you're doing percentages, it might be on 80% of opportunities. And it can even be a little more detailed. So it can be something like on 80% of opportunities over 2 consecutive days. You might be doing more trials, so 4 out of 5 trials. You might be doing steps in a toilet training program. So maybe the child has to complete all steps in the program independently over 2 consecutive days or something like that. So this tells you from your measurement system how many responses do they need to get correctly for you to say that they have mastered that objective and you can move on to the next one. Okay, so I have some examples for you guys, and I wanted y'all to identify the components. So if I were you guys, I would pause the video and kind of work on both of these on your own. And once you've figured out the answers on your own, then replay the video and you can hear me go through them. So for the first one, given a 15-minute period and an array of objects to manipulate, Tabitha will bring her hands to her mouth no more than a total of 3 minutes for 3 consecutive sessions. So our learner is Tabitha. Our behavior is we want her to bring her hand to her mouth. And the conditions are given a 15-minute period and an array of objects to manipulate. Those are the conditions under which the behavior should occur, or under which the behavior occurs. And then the criterion is going to be no more than a total of 3 minutes for 3 consecutive sessions. On our second one, our learner is Ed, and our behavior is we want him to eye point to the correct picture. The conditions are the behavior is going to occur when 2 photographs are held in front of Ed, and he's asked to show me the ball, cup, bed, or dish, one of those. And then criterion, so we will say that Ed has mastered this objective when the criterion is 80% of the trials over a 1-month period for each of the 4 pictures. If he can do that, then we're going to say that he has mastered that objective and move to the next one. Okay, with regards to measuring instructional or behavioral objectives, your criterion, that last part of it, is going to tell you what and how you're going to measure it. So once again, you need to figure out what dimension you're going to measure. you need to figure out your data collection system. So consider your frequency recording, opportunity, duration, everything that we talked about with regards to data collection systems, latency, permanent product recording if you can't directly observe the behavior, or even those indirect methods. So your partial interval recording, whole interval, or momentary time sampling. Just a word of caution for you guys. Make sure that whatever data collection system you use and whatever criterion you decide on, that you can actually practically implement and measure that behavior. So if you say something like, if you have the criterion of 100 times per school day, that means that you are watching the kid the whole school day and you count each and every instance of the behavior. If you can't do that, then you don't need, this is an example of event recording. So whenever you do that, event recording, remember, it's a continuous procedure. You have to observe the learner and count each and every behavior. If you can't do that, then you need to shorten your observation period. So maybe just observe during lunch or during math class or whenever the behavior is more likely to occur. Or use one of your discontinuous measurement procedures or something else. And then same thing with the criterion, they will engage in X behavior 80% of the time. You've dictated that you're going to be monitoring behavior 100% of the day. So just be careful about how you word it and your observation periods and everything like that. Make sure that you can actually practically observe the behavior in whatever data collection system you pick. All right, at the end of the chapter, your book has these really cool checklists, which I think are great to kind of keep and store away and use when you guys are doing your lesson planning. And so when you're planning instruction for the student, it has some kind of cool things to think about. Like I said, you guys can go through your lessons after you plan them and figure out, did you do them, did you partially do them, or did you not do them? So first of all, you want to identify a socially valid skill for the student, and it needs to be appropriate for their age and context, and a key success in and out of the school setting. You don't want to just pick a behavior to target just because you want to. It has to be socially appropriate, and it has to help them function in the real world. It has to increase independent functioning in the real world and set them up for success to actually be applicable to their own context. You want to make sure that you build your task analysis, and so using kind of a stairway that we talked about earlier with little Johnny. So you have longer steps that are built in. So you take your skill and you kind of divide it into longer steps, like we talked about, and then whatever steps the child cannot do, you want to break those longer steps into shorter steps. And also making sure that your expectations are realistic, like we talked about with the objectives and the criterion. And so if you guys look over here, this is really similar to our example that we did with little Johnny. So basically you have this end goal. You break it down into kind of long-term steps, which we call long-term objectives. And then if the child has any trouble with a long-term objective, you break those down into short-term objectives. So that's kind of what that looks like. And then making sure that you create objectives for each of those items of the task analysis. So you have the criterion. Remember, it's set by the baseline. We talked about that. It includes the conditions and make sure that it guides your teaching. So those short-term objectives are what's going to guide your teaching and your lesson planning. So let's go back to little Johnny. If we relate that diagram in the previous slide to this diagram, we have that our main goal is, our main behavioral objective is a successful lineup. So if we would write a behavioral objective for this, it might look something like this. When all students are sitting quietly on their desk and the teacher provides instruction to line up, Johnny will line up appropriately for 90% of opportunities each day for 1 month. So that's our end goal. That's what we want him to do. We want him to have a successful lineup and this is our objective that shows that he can actually successfully line up. Now remember, he can't do this, so we've broken our main goal into kind of four big, broad steps, and those are our long-term objectives. So since he can do our first long-term objective and our second one, I was just going to give you guys an example of how you would write this third long-term objective. So it would say something like, when the teacher gives a signal to line up, which is after our second one, Johnny will move to the line for 90% of opportunities per day over 3 consecutive days. And remember, he can't master this yet, so we've taken this and we've created this task analysis here. And these would be what we would refer to as our short-term objectives. And then we would need to write our objective for each of these short-term. So because he can do standing up and he can do pushing in a chair, I gave you guys an example of how you would write this one. So maybe when the teacher gives a signal to line up and Johnny has pushed in his chair, because he can do that, Johnny will walk directly to the line, which is right here, for 90% of opportunities per day over 3 consecutive days. So I just wanted to show you guys how this all kind of fits together. You have this complex skill, this overall goal, this main behavioral objective. You can break it down into kind of larger steps, which would be our long-term objectives. And if you can do those, cool. If you can't, then you want to break it down even further, do your task analysis, and break those down into short-term objectives and create your objectives that way. All right, guys, so we talked about phases of learning. We talked about acquisition, fluency, maintenance, generalization, and adaptation phases. We talked about identifying sub-skills or those prereq skills. We talked about task analyses and kind of the different aspects, task difficulty, temporal, and the criterion. And we talked about objectives and how to write them and the 4 components. So they need to include the learner, the behavior, the conditions, and the criteria. So, all right, guys, that's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.